panelists. And thank you to all of you for joining us for this really important conversation. We're going to start with some trailers and clips from some of the films we're talking about today to give some context to the conversation. So I'm first going to invite Lindsay to briefly introduce the clip for the film.
Terrific. So it's actually not a clip, it's a trailer. So we're going to see the trailer for From the Ashes, which is our first feature film. We released it with National Geographic last year.
Fantastic. We're going to hear specifically about the impact campaigns for each of these films, but for now I'm just going to invite Lindsay to tell us about the genesis of this film, where did it start, when and how did the impact campaign get involved, and you can include your role there for us.
Sure. So I work at, as I was introduced, I work at Bloomberg Philanthropies, and I manage all of our film projects. So I look across all areas of Mike Bloomberg's sort of charitable giving, whether that's arts and culture, environment, education, environment, as I said, and try to think about how we can use storytelling to help lift up these really powerful stories. And a big part of our work is focused on coal. And we have funded over $100 million into this Beyond Coal campaign. And it's really trying to move us off of coal and into cleaner energy sources. So we were thinking, you know, no one had really approached us. We also give grants to filmmakers, and I'm happy to talk to anyone after. But no one had really approached us on this subject before. This is not a story people were dying to tell. And as you can imagine, and you see in the trailer, coal is a really complex subject. And we really, you know, there's value and belief and understanding on both sides that we need to give light to and really show perspectives. So that's what we really tried to achieve in the film. It's hard in the age of Trump, and I'm sure we can all talk about this, how to make a film that extends a hand across the aisle. It's really hard, but I think that what you can do is always really focus on trying to show the most passionate, real, thoughtful expressions, perspectives on both sides, and hope that, you know, audiences are going to take away what they think is best.
Fantastic. Thank you. Our next group is a team, Simone and Chris, and I'm just going to invite Chris to give a brief intro to the trailer.
Yeah, so this is the trailer for Eating Animals. It's a project we worked on for a number of years, and I'll let it do its thing, and I can't wait to see your film.
Great, and if we can have Chris tell about the genesis of the film, and maybe Simone can tell about how the impact campaign got involved.
Well, I mean, the movie comes from a book. Jonathan wrote the book a couple of years before we actually started to make it into a film. Natalie read the book and moved from being a vegetarian to a vegan in the process, and they were looking to make it into a documentary. They both had seen a film I had previously done and contacted me, and then we all met in Jonathan's backyard in Brooklyn and started to hash out how we were going to get the financing and make the film. So, yeah. And one of the things that I kind of came to the table with was that I didn't want to make another food documentary. That seemed, we were very certain about that it wasn't another one that gives you, a litany of statistics about where your food comes from, and focus more on the individuals that are kind of in the dark shadow of this, I think it's fair to say, oppressive system. And so it takes you on multiple journeys through people, whether they're contract farmers or whistleblowers. And luckily, talking about crossing the aisle, we're very careful not to make, kind of a one-sided film. And luckily, having gone through, and we can talk about this in a little bit, but having done some of this impact, shows out in the Midwest, it's very relatable to the people that you would otherwise think would, shun the film. And the initial, the Eating Animals title is a tough one to kind of come to Duluth, Minnesota, or Lindsborg, Des Moines, Iowa, or Lindsborg, Kansas, but once people come in, they realize that there's a larger problem here than just what you put on your plate.
So my name is Simone Friedman. I manage EJF Philanthropies, which is my family's philanthropic umbrella. We're based in Washington, D.C. Before I did this, I had an analytics company, which I sold before I was asked by my uncle to take over what we're doing. And we're very, very interested in food systems. We also do a lot of grant making in other areas as well. One of the things the approach that we take with our philanthropy is really especially when we're dealing with complex systems, such as the food system, that I'm really looking at it from a lens of complexity theory, in the sense that, when you look at problems overall, there are simple problems, complicated problems, and complex problems. So, for example, a simple problem would be, like, if you're building a hospital, how do you actually get that hospital built? A complicated problem would be, well, if you're, developing a vaccine. And a complex problem would be if you're really trying to affect the health outcomes of an entire population. And so, with the food system, we really look at it like a complex problem. And when we're dealing with that sort of thing, I don't approach my philanthropy looking at, like, there's a logic model, there's a theory of change. I look at it like I have to identify those attractors, that, like, things that will happen in a system that might move the needle one way or the other, like sort of momentum changes or force changes. And so one of my grantees had actually been involved with helping Christopher with the film. He had involved a number of different nonprofit organizations as the film was being made. And I met him and I learned a little bit about the film. But what happened was that I actually went to Telluride Film Festival, where the film premiered, and I saw it for the first time, and I was literally just absolutely blown away by it, and its beauty and its power and the potential for this film to really be an attractor, to really, in a complex system, to really say this film might be the trigger that might really create systemic change. And so what we said was, well, we're just going to put a lot of money, or we'd love to be able to put a lot of money actually into helping the film get seen by as many people as possible, and really just spread the word about it. And so that was sort of how this all started. And it was a very non-traditional way for an impact campaign to start, since we'd already essentially had distribution and that sort of thing. So it's a very unusual relationship, but it's just been absolutely incredible. And we can talk more about what we've done.
Absolutely. Great. And lastly, we'll ask Anya to introduce the clips from The Feeling of Being Watched.
Great. So Feeling of Being Watched is actually one film of several projects that possibly I'll talk about in this next hour. But it's a first-person investigative piece directed by Asia Bundawi, who grew up in Bridgeview, Chicago. And this looks at what was ultimately the biggest FBI surveillance domestic terrorism probe before 9/11, and it was targeting her community. So she looks at basically the impact of 20 years of FBI surveillance on her community. So if you were here earlier, you got to hear Asia speak a little bit about on the Access panel, but ultimately this is her story. She grew up in this community. 2 years into filmmaking, she realized that really it made sense for her to turn the lens also onto herself. She had been interviewing and documenting her family and her neighbors, ultimately around this question of, have I grown up with this experience around FBI sort of being everywhere in our lives, or is there a level of paranoia? And what she uncovered was 33,000 documents about her community and this massive probe that was called Operation Vulgar Betrayal. Pre-9/11, so it was ultimately, this film looks at both the toll on a human and psychological level of these kinds of programs, how flimsy often they are in terms of evidence, but how broad and far-reaching they can be. And this is one film that is one of the films that Multitude Films, which is committed to producing documentaries by underrepresented voices, so women, people of color, queer, and trans filmmakers. And we really care about representational storytelling, so that a core component of the core team that are creating this film has a direct stake in the story that's being told. And my role as a producer is to bring the lens of impact to the projects that we work on through production, to release into the impact campaign. So I'll often work with the teams on hiring the impact producer, but also from early stages talking through what are the goals and what's the kind of role that these directors believe that they can interrupt or change or contribute to in broader conversations. In this case, this is looking at sort of the human experience and really pulling the veil over these FBI surveillance programs was one way that, a really new way for us to be looking at these broader stories of national security and what that means for our collective democracy. But ultimately, this is a film that's also oriented, while there are many different connections to understanding and thinking about sort of like the key pillars of our democracy, also looking at these long histories of targeting and racial profiling by the state on communities of color and of activists and of dissenters.
Great. And I can tell you that having watched all these films, even just seeing these trailers and short clips, I'm brought back to a lot of the emotions I felt and a lot of the passions they bring out. So I highly recommend that you check every single one out. Before we go to some more general questions, I just want to have each person or team briefly describe the impact campaign in terms of what are the goals and steps to kind of give you guys a real picture of what these folks are doing. Can we start with you?
Sure. So for us, it was really trying to get people to see, coal for being a complex issue. It was really interesting. We started working on our film, the decision to make it, before Trump even threw his hat in the ring. And regardless of your politics, he went on and on throughout the election cycle about, wanting to bring the coal miners back to work. Pretty sure he's still saying it all the time. And we really needed to have people understand, that coal is just one of many industries that are going to be on the chopping block as we go into the future. And we really need to be able to have people articulate and understand that these issues are far more complex than whatever you're hearing on day-to-day news media. And so that, the goal for us was really try to get as many people, and we all say this, get as many people to see it. And I think from an impact producing standpoint, for us, it's about making the film as accessible as possible. I'm imagining most of you guys in here are filmmakers, producers, and interested in the impact space. And I'd really suggest making, a real concerted effort to work with a distributor, or if you're doing it yourself, to make the film as accessible as possible, because that's allowed us to screen the film. We've done over 500 grassroots screening of our film. We targeted all 50 states. We really did a concerted effort in coal country, but wanted to make sure that not only was the film accessible to everyone in any way possible, we'll mail it to you, it's free on the internet, it's everywhere, but it's also accompanied by a toolkit that really allows you to kind of explore and examine issues in a lens maybe you hadn't thought of before.
So I'll just pick up and then have Simone talk about how she laid out the plans for impact in our partnership and what we intended to do. So going back to Telluride, Simone and her uncle came up to me after the screening, and what was so interesting about it was because it was influential to a certain degree about the decision I made with a distributor, because it was at that time we were vying with Netflix and then IFC, Sundance Selects, and one of the attractive things that came out of that conversation, that was after the premiere, the morning after the premiere, was that they really wanted to put money to influence people seeing where their food comes from. So when I went back to negotiating, it was actually easier for me to look at it, whereas with Netflix, although it can be an incredible platform for any documentary, I was really interested in kind of the old school way of going about it, and having people see it at events with farmers, and so that was something that was really always attractive to me. So this became a possibility, and then I had to merge my new impact partnership with the distributor, which isn't easy. That's another process. You have to kind of talk through and go through the process, because they want to do what they do, and you want to have a long shelf life with your film and have it go out in new and inventive ways. But we managed to make that happen, and that was something that just really, I can't imagine the film without the impact arm of it, because it's been so significant and successful.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I've always mentioned to Christopher, I sort of approach this like we feel honored in a way to really to be involved with this, just because, we're coming from this perspective. This is really the first film that we've gotten involved in. It's been just, it's been such a fantastic experience. I'd love to, going forward, I'm planning to get involved in a lot more films, just because this has just been such an incredible opportunity for us as philanthropists to really use, to look at things in a different way. And I think, I've been doing our philanthropy now for more than full-time, for 7-8 years, and I've never, ever as a philanthropist felt like I've been able to feel the impact that we're having on people, and that we're really able to even see what happens as a result. Whereas when we do traditional grant making, which we do a lot of traditional grant making, we give away a lot of money, I feel much more removed from the process. But I'll just say, with this film, it really my original goal was really the same goal as the distributors, which is IFC Sundance Selects, which is to really get as many people to see the film as possible, because we feel like anybody who sees the film will be impacted by it. It's that powerful. And so what I really felt like, well, we just want to help get it out there. And so the first goal was really audience engagement, of really just building audiences. Can I connect the film to my network of grantees, which my network of grantees is quite large. More importantly, I have a network of other philanthropists and foundations, whom I'm close to, and they have a whole network of grantees, really spanning millions and millions of people who are interested in these issues. And so the first step in what I was doing was really can I activate all those other people that I know in my networks to really build the audiences for this. And so that was the first step. And then from there, we really had a series of also influencer screenings. And, one of my ideas was that we really want to get this film in front of people in the finance community who can shift capital to different places, who can shift capital to different plant-based foods for more sustainable farming. And so I have had a series of screenings, with Christopher and in this financial world, and really showing this film to people who oversee billions and billions and billions of dollars. And there have been investment decisions that have been made as a result of the film, which is just absolutely incredible. I feel like we're just at the beginning of what we can do in terms of using this film as a trigger for changes in how local farmers are supported around the country. There's a number of ideas that have come out of that. But also, in addition to that, really, there's been a separate agenda. In some ways, there's a separate idea, too, of really helping the causes and the issues that are close to the subjects of the film that Christopher profiled. And I really feel like these guys are heroes, and these guys have really gone out of their... it was not easy for them to be vulnerable and to sort of let Christopher capture their vulnerability and their stories. And I feel like they should really be honored and supported. And so what I'm doing is really trying to specifically support each subject's organization that they're involved with, each subject's cause, their goals, what they're trying to do, so that they feel like this experience, not just allowing themselves to be caught on camera, but also to what they've done in their lives. And how I have so much respect for them that I want to help further that. And so every major hero in the film, I've been involved with trying to support with their work as well.
And then just to add a little bit to that, being a documentary filmmaker, which I'm sure this is a room full of documentary filmmakers, you're panting at the end of the finish line. You barely have, you're financially in the rough, you're exhausted. And one of the great things, and I, now I'll always kind of focus on finding impact producing partnership, because there's great things that come along with it, but it gives you a strong arm when you get your film out. So it's not just a distributor that's doing it, but all the reasons why you wanted to make the film are kind of aligned with somebody who has the resources to get the film to unlikely places like the Milken Conference in Los Angeles, which we showed the film, and seemingly, what does it have to do with billionaires all talking about economic policy? But we got in there, and it was a whole new group that were thinking, and it turns out a lot of them were thinking about this and know it's a problem and are investing long-term into plant-based alternatives. So it was such a surprise to me to get to a place where I otherwise wouldn't have thought of, and also that kind of conversation had, that the top, kind of down philosophy seemed to work, even though, and then go to the other side, we were working with the farmers who have all these organizations that they really kind of, this support system. So we covered the full spectrum of where we could go with the film, which is very unusual because most documentaries play in urban centers, and it's hard to get them to play, out in Mason City, Iowa. You just can't do that. But with the financial resources of an impact producer, they put that on, they underwrite the film getting there with people to be there, and it becomes very communal in a very positive way.
And I'll just say also, in some ways, I've been unusual with this in that, I'm thinking about this impact campaign, but also I have the resources to fund it as well. So in some ways, it's really been a wonderful opportunity to have that. And also, I'll just mention that I think there's a real difference. Not everybody. Something I learned that not everybody in the documentary film world understands is that there's a big difference between working with nonprofits themselves and working with funders or philanthropists. Right? It's very different. I would highly recommend that you try to identify a funder or a philanthropist with whom you can work, because sometimes there can be a lot of territorial issues among nonprofits, and with a funder, or somebody who's actually funding all these organizations and who can engage other networks of funders, you can really create a much more collaborative kind of experience. And it can move very quickly. And move very, very quickly. And so I mean, just we've, in addition to this finance sector idea, I mean, we've had screenings all over the country. We've had screenings in D.C., where I'm from, with Senator Cory Booker, who's a friend, and we're involving. I mean, I just gave a grant for 400 public performance licenses for the film to get colleges and universities all over the country, and
which is now 377.
Yes, I know, we're almost done. I actually just sent them this morning. I said I'm happy to give more money if there's more, and there is, So, yeah. So I'll just say that it's just been such an incredible experience.
So Feeling of Being Watched just released at Tribeca and is making its way through the film festival circuit, but we just had our first community screening, which is a series, which will be the pilot of a 12-state community engagement campaign that we'll be doing in tandem with both a theatrical and a broadcast in the summer and fall of 2019. And through the 5 years of making this film, Asya and our team has worked closely with Center for Constitutional Rights and Brennan Center for Justice, and a number of other organizations that have informed both the research and some of the content and orientation and framing and analysis that went into the Feeling of Being Watched. And so we're working both with a number of these organizations in thinking about how this film can support the work that they're already doing and bring to light and bring personal entry points for ways in around community safety work, around challenging targeting of Muslim communities, but also communities of color around the country. But ultimately, the genesis for this 12-state community engagement campaign has a focus and orientation around healing from collective trauma that is ongoing, because many of the people in this film and around the country still experience very direct interventions in their lives by the FBI and by the state. And so, though there are a number of different efforts around know your rights and around legal work and advocacy work, not enough, but there are a number. Asya, both rooted in her personal experience of feeling like there's a piece here that's missing around healing and what does it actually mean to live with this ongoing trauma and how that affects each person on a day-to-day basis, understanding that in on collective terms and in collective forums, there could be a different kind of opportunity to both challenge and look back on these programs, because many of them succeed and are sustained and expand because of the shroud of secrecy and silence that they rely on, and also to create a space sort of modeled and informed by truth and reconciliation commissions around the world that can create sort of community power and agency by talking and addressing kind of the impact of these programs. So that's one example, but our other, I think the way that we sort of approach impact campaigns broadly is around, you're looking at who are the levers of influence and the actors and the kind of change that you want to address, right? And so in this case, even though this film, in addition to this 12 Takes community engagement campaign, we also are building an interactive platform with MIT to both make the 33,000 documents available to the public and equip communities around the country to be able to file their own FOIAs and upload and engage more of these FBI documents and share their own personal stories of what the impact has been on them. So to create this, both a mapping and the process of people being able to engage with and understand kind of both qualitatively and quantitatively what the impact of these programs are. And I share that because that's a resource for journalists, but it's also a resource for communities, and it's a way of taking back power. And in that case, the primary audience for our team is Muslim American communities and secondarily communities of color. But there are so many different entry points in that the journalists sort of deep dive into these programs creates access points for many more communities around the country to also be thinking about kind of where their tax dollars are going, what the war on terror and these national security projects actually really mean on the ground. For another project, which is called Always in Season, directed by Jacqueline Olive, which looks at the last 100 years of the history of lynching and how that racial terrorism relates to racial terror today, both through the lens of contemporary stories of suspected hangings and lynchings. That orientation for that campaign is also informed by a number of different organizations, including the King Center for Nonviolent Social Action, ACLU, among a host of other organizations that are interested in using this film in building cross-racial coalitions around also breaking the silence around the impact of this legacy and this history and being able to move towards systems of reparations and reconciliation. So once you determine sort of who those actors and the spheres of influence are and who your partners are, that can then inform how you build the campaign. And I think that I think it's really powerful and exciting and wonderful when you have a funder that's on board and ready to resource it, and also that's not always the case. And the relationships that you can build across partnerships and across communities and across teams can actually not only ground kind of the perspective and analysis that you bring and how this film can contribute and build on conversations that are already at play, but can also help you be really targeted and far-reaching in the kinds of networks, just as you were saying, the networks that can then have access to and really take on as their own this film. And I think that there's something also important to recognize, that not every director is excited or interested about doing an impact campaign or necessarily has the skills or orientation. It's really community organizing work, and oftentimes directors are coming from a journalistic perspective or from more of an arts perspective, and it's really important to have a sense about where is your appetite and who are the best people to complement your team so that you can ultimately focus on the thing that you're most equipped to do and most, that the film can actually have the biggest role if you're understanding also where your limitations are and also where your capacity is.
I'll just respond quickly. One of the things I'm hoping to do starting next year is really figure out a way to bring more philanthropists and more foundations into this world, right? That it's been an eye-opener for me, and I feel like there's so much money out there that could be going into impact that's not going into impact right now because philanthropists and foundations don't know how to do this, right? They've never done this before. They don't understand, or they're looking for very specific outcomes, and they don't realize that when you are dealing with complex systems, you can't necessarily measure it exactly the way that they're used to it. But I think if there's a way to just kind of shift their mindset a little bit, and I've started to do this already by speaking at different philanthropy conferences about this potential, I think that for every issue area, there should be a philanthropist or foundation that could fund it, right? That I would love to see that. That's my sort of goal and my vision for next year at this time, maybe, that that we'll actually have this whole network of philanthropists who are going to do this.
I like it. Great. I wanted to ask about, I know a lot of people out here probably have films that have, issue-based, complex stories like these. And in many cases, the individuals in the films are taking a big risk by telling their stories. And sometimes that risk could even be amplified by an impact campaign that increases their visibility both in their own community and also sort of on the national or even international stage. I was curious if you guys have any examples of what challenges you've navigated resulting from someone's story becoming amplified in this way, and also if any opportunities have arisen from that.
So I think that this is a hard film for lots of audiences, but I think particularly if your family has been the direct target of FBI surveillance. And when we shared this film in Chicago recently, so we had a town hall, 500 community members came out. This was, in many cases, the first time that many of them were understanding and seeing the full extent of this program. They were very familiar with the FBI knocking on their door. And in some cases, some people shared since the age of 3. So over the last, 2 decades, ultimately, of that becoming sort of an abnormal normal. But it was very clear, and a lot of people shared really courageously just how hard it was to actually both have the feelings come up of actually sort of reckoning with not just a history but a real present, and how pervasive and broad this program is, and not just on the toll that they've had of what the impact that's had on their relationships with each other, on their relationships with themselves, around understanding and sort of thinking about kind of how to trust what's what. But also of knowing that these are programs that a lot of communities around the country and around the world, but around the country, have continued to navigate and have to live under. So there was something about both sort of a power of being able to share this and talk, for many people talking about this for the very first time, in some cases having been told by the FBI to not talk about it with their neighbors because they were told that it would get worse. But of also having to live and feel kind of the full breadth of this. And we were very intentional about having a counselor at that town hall to open up this conversation. But I think that what was really clear for us is that we need to have a number of other professionals who can be there to both support people as they're continuing to live and respond to these experiences, and that part of our work is also of connecting, and this is already part of the vision, but part of our work was also around connecting community members who aren't already activated to a number of the different organizations and teams in their local communities that are working on this issue from different ends, so that there's sort of a sense of like, what can you do beyond actually feeling and encountering this, and a sense of also being able to recognize that there is work across communities, different communities over the course of the last century who have developed different systems around community resilience and safety to be able to learn from. And that, I think, has been something that's been, both will inform the design, but I think that's already been really powerful to see that the connection points that can contribute to. And
for us, all this, for I'm sure most haven't seen the film. So there's everybody from contract farmers, and contract farmers are basically in the system of these vertically integrated systems. They are really kind of at the bottom, as one of our farmers said, shit rolls downhill and I live at the bottom of the hill. So they have they're usually indebted. It's a system that puts them in debt to the corporation. So there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands. The average ones that I visited were $500,000-$600,000 in debt to the corporation. So, or to the bank. And, so there's a vulnerability opening up your door to a camera guy and showing how these chickens are raised. And that was a very brave moment. And I think they really hammered him hard, knowing that he opened the door to myself and also Nicholas Kristof from the New York Times, and they really went after him and battered him. They visited his farm, almost every day, looking for excuses. And they wanted to paint him as a bad apple. And if it wasn't for the support systems that were in place, even though the film wasn't finished, to help him kind of get through that, I think he probably, it was going to be a really bad scenario. He went into a deep depression. This is Craig Watts, because his family, he was 50, had 3 kids. He was indebted to the system. But, the film coming out has empowered him. He's really in a much brighter place. If you see at the end of our film, he has these black saucer eyes and is really withdrawn. And now, if you get, he's cutting up, audiences across America because he's a real jokester, and is gone. He was just at Farm Aid, thanks, where he was, a centerpiece on stage. And then the other one was the whistleblower who went up against the government. And just to tie in FBI, so, we filmed with him in this area. This is a Frankenstein lab that's in the middle of America in Nebraska, and they manipulate animals to see if they can get higher productive, or get higher yields from doing these Frankenstein experiments on these animals. And he was the vet that worked 23 years at the U.S. Mark. And we were filming with him, and it took a long time to get him to even respond to my emails. And I eventually kind of drove to his house and met his family, and he decided to do this. And again, he was with Michael Moss, with New York Times, big investigative thing came out, and he just ended up in this place where he was in big trouble because he was going up against the U.S. government, and he was also going up against USDA. And we were confronted by the U.S. Mark security at one point when we were filming, and she said, I want all your information. I had to say, are you a state police, because it was a state road? And she said, no. And I said, then you don't have any right to stop me. In fact, you're breaking the law yourself. Well, that didn't go over well. So when we left, unfortunately, filming, Jim got a knock at the door, and it was FBI agents for the Special Eco-Terrorist Unit, and sat down at their kitchen table and opened up a book that was about that thick of Jim. So, yeah, it's not easy to talk about these very hard subjects and then have these people come in, but again, it goes back to the support of impact investing, because what we were able to do was, so Simone underwrote, in her philanthropic group, was able to underwrite it going to Nebraska, University of Nebraska, where he was a professor and was ousted. Because of this, they strangleholded him, and he lost his tenureship. But in that process, he was able to go back and show it in a very positive light, and there was a community that surrounded him. Where when I had kind of left him when we were in the edit stages, he was a pariah in his community. So it comes around.
Yeah, and actually, so I was just with Jim Keene, whom Christopher's mentioning, about a month and a half ago or so. We were actually in Nebraska, and we did the screening for people there in his community. And he had basically, since the film, in some ways, he'd been sort of living by himself, and he hadn't really been engaging with the community. He's felt like everybody is against him, which is true, they really are. But by having the film there, just even having the screening, it opened up a whole group of people who've really, since just in the last month or so, have really embraced him. And he got standing ovations, and I mean, just people really understood how brave he was for doing what he did. And we did an NPR interview locally, and Jim and I spoke in front of a group of local high school students, and it's just been incredible to sort of have that kind of experience for him. And I think that he's still in danger of losing his tenure, but I think that at least I'm hoping he feels a little bit more supported, and I'm also hoping separately to support some of his work.
But more importantly, what he says that, towards the end of the film, he says, I'm much more comfortable in the skin of activism than I was in the secret world of that I never felt. So it was, even though it destroyed his family, in a lot of ways, and he got a divorce through this whole process because it really jeopardized his family. There's something really wonderful about how it freed him up to feel right about himself again. And he's been able to use that and working with Humane Society and a number of other organizations to go out and have a new chapter of activism.
I'd add just one more story, and I sometimes struggle with the what we should call our documentary subjects in films, because I'm kind of hating the word subjects, and these people they're sharing this really brave story, and their life hopefully goes on much further than the story you've captured. In the case of From the Ashes, it was really difficult to find coal miners who were willing to speak out against the industry. It was not. I can't even remember how many people we went through, but it wasn't until we found, through Facebook, someone's friend of a friend of a friend back in Appalachia, knew someone, and we really lucked out. And you saw them in the trailer, the Lily couple, Regina and Cecil, and they really talk about the hardships that they face when he doesn't have a job, because it's very touch and go when, or if and when he's going to be hired. And we captured them at a downturn, and so he wasn't hired at the time. And months go on, and we're staying in touch with them throughout production, kind of keeping them up to date. And right before the film is set to come out, Cecil has great news. He got a job. He's back at the coal mines. And for him, we're thrilled that he has a job. That the reality is they need to pay the bills. But at the same time, we were really worried that the timing of the film was going to really impact his real life. And so we made sure that they had a chance to see the film before. Obviously, you have to balance that line of journalistic integrity and not letting the relationships get in the way of the editorial decisions. But we really tried to bring them along for the ride and make sure that they understand we were never trying to exploit anything that was going on in their life, and really wanted to protect them and only use the story in a way that was going to further this narrative, not make their life harder. So you can really run into these, and I feel like we've all had these kind of tricky situations where you want the film to live on, but this person also has a life to live.
Yeah. I think that's such an important point, because sometimes teams can feel like their film is building off of a bigger issue and a sort of a more important story, and looking at sort of this structural change, and kind of lose sight of, even when they've gotten this access and they've earned the trust of the people that they're highlighting in their films, but then sort of leave them along the wayside when those stories when sort of their goals or priorities don't contend with the broader orientation of the film team. And I think that that's obviously a really complicated, they're complicated power dynamics and complicated relationships that ultimately are really informed by the kind of relationship you build all the way through, and the kind of communication and clarity and sort of understanding and expectations that you can contribute to with as much integrity and honesty and sort of foresight as possible. But I think that it's something that particularly in sort of the visibility and the momentum of these films sort of, in certain cases, best case scenario can have, it's also really important to not lose sight of and to not forget the risks and courage that it's taken for people to actually give their time and both their real life experience and also the stakes that they have still ahead of them with the making of this film.
Well, I have so many more questions I want to ask you all, but at this point, we want to give a chance for those of you who are here with us to ask questions. If you'd like to ask a question, we have a microphone up here, and we ask that you come on up.
Hi, thanks for that amazing panel. There's 100 questions I'd love to ask, but I'm going to try to stick to two. One is, given the impact you're trying to make, that probably means that there are people out there who don't want the issues coming to light. Wondering if you could talk to anyone who, maybe not in particular, but the challenges you had to overcome in getting these stories to even make it. And then Christopher, I'd love to hear from you about, you say you put everything in, of course you're at like the finish line and then you have almost nothing left. And then just kind of like logistically, what kind of like legal / insurance do you need to have ready for these types of challenges?
I'll go ahead and answer that and then maybe roll it into the so yeah, it was very interesting because we were going up against titans of the food industry. So it was not an easy, and constantly worried because I have a family, just like the people I've been filming, and the vulnerability was felt, in that process, because these are big mammoth conglomerations. So we did what Jonathan did, which is I wrote, or we called, or I had Natalie call. We tried to reach out to the meat industry, let them know, one, that we're making it, but that they're welcome to be a part of it, the discussion. And we didn't get anybody answering back. So then that kind of at least set the playing field. We knew that there wasn't going to be open communication with them. And then it's also, this idea of how are they going to react when it comes out? Well, because of Blackfish, I think this is a good example where, SeaWorld wrongly went on the offensive against the filmmakers, and instead, Blackfish wouldn't be what it is if they hadn't done that. It ended up staying in the papers for a couple of months, right? This controversy, and that's how people really knew about the film and saw it. So in a lot of ways, it would have been great if something like that happened. But there were two companies in particular that, Tyson and Purdue, that don't come out looking great in the film. I think we're trying to be as fair and balanced, but you see how their systems really, press the farmers into the ground. But Jim Purdue, since it's still a private company, it's a huge corporation, but it's owned privately by he ended up going to visit every single person that was in my film before the film came out. So it was a very interesting thing, because I would get a call, and Frank Reese, the turkey farmer that you see there, he was like, yeah, Jim Purdue stopped on by. And so I think for him, they were very smart about it in a lot of ways, because they knew the writings on the wall. Factory farming is a doomed system. It's underwritten by our subsidies and our taxpayers' dollars. So eventually, just like coal, it's going to become a thing of the past. And he's a smart guy. He's a marine biologist, but he also runs this, this food company. So he integrated himself and said, we really want to change. And he ended up buying one of the pork in the farmer, Nyman Ranch. They ended up purchasing the company. So in a lot of ways, hats off to them. They kind of found a way to integrate themselves at the end of it. And I know Tyson wasn't very happy at all about the scenario. But luckily, knock on wood, we seem to have kind of made our way through. Interesting, anecdotally, the Tyson invested now 10% into the plant-based company that we follow in the film. So it's a weird relationship, but it's gotten smarter. It's not just like, going up against these giants and they try and sue you. We were meticulous that everything that was said in the film was 3-sourced. which took a long time. It was months of evaluating to make sure that we got our E&O insurance, so we were able to kind of move forward. But two, we didn't want to get caught up in litigation like what happened with Joe Berlinger and Crude or some other scenario. So we really did our homework, which is hard to do when you're trying to creatively shape a film, and you forget about that, you know, in that process. But it was a really, you know, you finished the edit, and then at night you would go in and start to work on. But that's, you know, it's part of the process of standing up to, you know, FBI or to the coal industry, is that you are, you know, it's a tough and risky thing. I hope that answered your question anyway.
Thank you.
There was a other first part of the question. I got it. Okay. Okay.
I also asked about just like legal insurance, like just amount of budget, like you set aside.
Yeah, E&O insurance. So you need a big chunk. You have to go out and put in, depending on what the liability is, you have to plan on having a lot of E&O. If you can't afford it, which most, I'm sure, you know, doc projects that are in production, you have to figure out a way to get somebody to pay for it or step up. So we did finishing funds at the end to help pay for the kind of robust, you know, stuff that we needed at the end. And then you also have to have a little bit in the bank for if you do have to go up against lawsuits, and you have to find lawyers that will help protect you in that scenario. And we did that. We had a small budget in for finding the right people to help.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how you were involved in these outreach campaigns. Less so for eating animals, because you mentioned that you got involved at the very end. But for Bloomberg, it really sounds like you view this as your movie. And so I'm curious at what point you got involved in it, whether you were funding it from the very beginning with an eye towards impact or just towards production. And in your case, I'm so sorry, I have seen the feeling of being watched, but I'm not sure I understood entirely, you know, whether you're working from an outside impact company or a distribution company, or at what point you kind of get into it.
I can go first. So I am a co-producer on From the Ashes. I manage all the projects for the foundation, and from the sort of development phase throughout. And for From the Ashes, that was our first production. So I do see it as ours. We worked in partnership with Radical Media, and they were fantastic partners. Mike Bonfiglio directed our film. He's a great director. But we're really in it with them, really trying to workshop what the story is, trying to draw on our network of partnerships to really inform what the story could be. And then also trying to take our own approach. You know, Bloomberg is known for being very data-driven. And I think, you know, a big part, and we didn't get too much into this in our impact strategy, but or talking about it at least, but trying to really use the data as a way to inform this story. And it's embedded throughout the entire film, and really trying to make sure that people walk away well equipped with some key statistics as to what really is the situation or what's really going on. So that's sort of, you know, does that answer the question? Okay.
Yeah, so it sounds like you were on board from the very beginning as a
From the very beginning.
Yeah.
And Multitude Films is a production company, so there are 3 producers, Lisa Valencia Svensson, Jessica Devaney, and myself. And Jessica Devaney produced The Feeling of Being Watched. And I came on as co-producer and to help bridge this sort of production to impact strategy. And we're just now at the phase of launching this broader impact campaign. So we work with projects at different stages, from the earliest stages. If a director is at the earliest stages, I'm producing another documentary that's a follow-up to the Brandon Tina story, which was the first documentary about violence against a trans person, Brandon Tina, in Falls City, Nebraska. And that film, though it didn't have a formal impact campaign, has been used in law enforcement around the country of what not to do with rape victims. It's been used by ACLUs around the country and was very informative and important for legislation around hate crime legislation around the country. So my first conversations with Greta Alefsdottir and Susan Muska, who are the directors of that film, was around, building off of those relationships that sort of came organically through that film, through the universities that are, that have Brandentina story as part of their curriculums, through obviously these continued relationships with the ACLU and with legislators and LGBTQ organizations around the country. How can this next follow-up piece that looks at sort of the impact of the life and death of Brandentina and looks at sort of where are the changes in perceptions and changes of understanding and acceptance for LGBTQ communities in the heartland, that's ground one, and sort of thinking about a very personal story and a character-driven story, but ultimately a story that we think can contribute to next conversations around understanding gender and gender acceptance.
And so you're driving the impact campaigns in-house then?
Yeah, so I produce with that lens. So for The Feeling of Being Watched, Ahlam Syed is our impact producer, and she has been following this film for a long time and has been in sort of broader, is an organizer. And I mean, speaking about that risk piece, she really came on sort of feeling moved that even though taking on the impact producer role brings more risk to her and her family, that bringing more of a public eye on this and having the backing of a number of these different organizations and funders, that there is a different kind of power and change that's possible. So Asya and Ahlam and I are working closely on building out the scope of this project.
Thank you.
I'm also interested kind of in a nuts and bolts question. I'm interested, I guess I'm going to ask the question of Simone and Christopher, sort of, what's your infrastructure look like? I mean, you've got this philanthropies group. How many people were you able to hire to kind of how long have you been in business doing the impact campaign? A year?
Yeah, it's been a little bit more than a year.
Okay, but so I would besides the two of you, who are the people behind the impact campaign so that you can even do the work to get out 400 copies to colleges and universities?
So I've given a series of grants to different partners, people who've done some of the legwork on the ground. So for example, we worked with a group called ProSocial, which did some of the reaching out. They reached out to about 160 different nonprofits. Some of them, quite a few of them were my grantees or my other philanthropists I know grantees. They had a small staff. The I'm working with an educational distributor, Roku Films, that IFC is partnering with. But I also, though, work very, very long hours. And, I don't really, through this process, it's really been that I'm pretty much working on this and sleeping and eating and exercising. But and also, I'm trying to, unfortunately, I feel bad for I have, over across my whole philanthropic umbrella, we actually have over 100 grantees spanning many, many different sectors: education, healthcare, wildlife conservation. I haven't been doing a very good job of keeping up with my other grantees just because I've been so excited about this project, and I have
expanded.
Well, it's really helpful for me because it's exhausting. Like I said, at the end, as a filmmaker, you go through the festival circuit, and then you're doubling your duty traveling by going to these impact events. So it's exhausting, and you're away from your family. So to have infrastructure is essential. And the great thing about Simone is she had her own company, so she manages extremely efficiently. So I think in any other circumstances it could fall apart and not be a good scenario. But there's a precision that goes. So she's like, we need this. So ProSocial. She granted ProSocial, who had the infrastructure for people to do various jobs, and at the same time, Roku Films, which IFC brought on, and we're very happy with, a great organization out of San Francisco, and they did the educational component and also this kind of larger kind of international arm that's getting underway, and this was all helped and underwritten by Simone's philanthropy family. So this all works in a way where you can segment and you don't have to take it on as the filmmaker and then have like 6 people next to you in your home manning the phones, that it was just well organized. And that's a very key thing, because otherwise, if it doesn't run well, you start to run yourself into the ground, as a filmmaker anyway.
Super. And we just have time for one more question. Oh, two quick questions.
Okay, so really quick. I'm a psychologist and a filmmaker, and I'm doing my own impact campaign, going to schools and working with the New York City Human Rights Commission, and it's exhausting. And so in terms of next steps, it sounds like, just from hearing the end, going to educational distributors, one would be able to connect with sort of an impact producer, or like where do you go when you're ready for more of a structure?
How to find an impact producer.
Yes.
I'll be brief, but the best thing to do is start, when you start on a subject, to find the people who really care about it. So we found investors who were aligned with the idea of fixing the food system, and that's who we aligned ourselves with all along. And if you can start to pick up somebody that would be potentially a good candidate for impact producing, I would start courting early while you're in the process of making the film, or even if it's in a preparatory stage. You can find that right person, and because it's everything to make sure it's also the right person, as you were giving the cautionary tales of not getting stymied by a large company that doesn't align with you, or a large philanthropic group.
There's some other great groups like Picture Motion, Film Sprout, Pro Social. They're out there. They can help, and they're more for hire. But I also wouldn't discount someone who, just really understands the space that you're in. They shouldn't be nervous that they've never worked with a film before, because you're really just focused on creating moments of convenings, and it's the network that's the most important.
I would absolutely second that. So I mean, if you can find a funder, for example, who's active in the space but hasn't really necessarily viewed the film as something to get involved in, but they can take all of their skills and all of their networks and knowledge and passion that they've had engaging in the issue and trying to solve the issue, and just apply it to the film, because it's really the same thing. I mean, you're giving them a gift. I mean, as filmmakers, you're giving foundations and philanthropists a gift that you have these tools that you're developing for people, and they should love to be involved and to help you and help to, for free. I mean, it's not, I guess in some cases, in other cases not, but that would be, I just think it's something that to absolutely consider.
Thank you.
Thank you for getting to me. I have a short film here in the festival. And it seems like, if you're a filmmaker, the distribution model sort of favors features. But if we're talking about impact and a sort of different funding model, and an idea where you can travel with the film, you can take it to venues where people watch it and stick around and have a real conversation. It doesn't take as much time out of someone's busy life. Where do you stand on short films? How interested are you in that sort of 10 to 20 minute sweet spot where you can get a lot of festival programming and just engage with people in a slightly different way, even if it doesn't work for distribution in the same way?
Every project I've ever worked on, everyone said, can it be shorter? I don't think, especially in the impact space, and I feel like our films are pretty short for features, but I think that for impact, short films are fantastic. We often make projects where we can make them modular even. So our film, you could kind of cut it up into about 6 parts and really focus on one given theme. So shorter is not at a disservice. I think from an impact standpoint, you've actually hit a sweet spot.
Yeah, there's also, there's a ton of growth in that area, and I think that a lot of both funders, though there hasn't been a lot of funding historically around shorts, I think that area is really growing, and a lot of funders know that that's an area that they want to look and sort of explore more into, and I really agree that you can do much more engaged programming when you have that sort of as the foundational point and people aren't exhausted after a long film. So I think that a lot of people are beginning to understand that, and I think on the impact producer lens, just of recognizing that people don't need to have a title as an impact producer to be a great person who has the community organizing skills or the education skills, or also for the shorts, who can actually, a film is one powerful way of opening the conversation and giving people in really efficient ways an entry point and a new understanding. But ultimately, it's sort of a text that many people are already familiar with. Like how do you start a deep conversation? That's ultimately, this is a launching point to be able to do. And anyone who has the skills around coordination and who can think around networks and who can think about sort of a long-term strategy is a great person to be working with.
Great. Well, thank you so much to our audience members for these great questions. Yes.